Energy access is now a direct balance sheet risk for CFOs. Grid access risk is now a balance sheet problem. CFOs need to model before committing capital. When a capital project stalls waiting on a substation upgrade, that is not an operations problem. That is stranded capital. The financial exposure from grid access constraints is real, it is growing, and most finance teams are not modeling it yet. There is a category of financial risk that tends to get misclassified until it's too late to hedge, the kind that lives inside operational assumptions everyone treats as settled. Energy availability has been one of those assumptions for most of corporate finance's institutional memory. Power is a cost input. You model the price, you maybe model the volatility. You don't model whether the power will actually be there when you need it. That's the assumption breaking down in 2026. And for CFOs, it's materializing not as an abstract energy market concern, but as a concrete capital planning problem. How grid access delays are creating capital deployment risk across infrastructure projects. The clearest symptom is capital deployment delay. A project approved by the board, funded, and under development hits a grid access problem. The substation is near capacity, the utilities upgrade timeline is 24 months, and there's no workaround that doesn't involve significant cost or schedule change. Capital is deployed, returns are not generating. In a higher interest rate environment, carrying delayed projects is materially more expensive than it was 3 years ago, when many of these infrastructure and decarbonization commitments were originally modeled. The National Infrastructure Advisory Council's 2024 Transformer Supply Chain Report documented that average lead times for large power transformers have expanded from roughly 50 weeks in 2021 to approximately 120 weeks in 2024. Some units are quoting delivery timelines of 4 years or more. That's not a supply chain anomaly that will normalize next quarter. It represents a structural constraint on how quickly grid infrastructure can respond to new load, which is a structural constraint on how quickly capital-intensive facilities projects can operationalize. For a project with an 18-month expected construction timeline, a 24-month utility upgrade requirement doesn't push the project back 6 months. It requires a full financial remodel, revised revenue ramp, adjusted debt service schedules, potentially renegotiated project financing terms, and in some cases, a fundamental reassessment of whether the project pencils out at all under the revised timeline. Why energy access risk doesn't fit standard corporate risk registers. Grid access risk doesn't have a clean home on most risk registers. It's not market risk. It's not credit risk. It sits somewhere between operational risk and infrastructure risk, a category most finance teams haven't had to formally manage because until recently it didn't materially affect outcomes. That's changing. Moody's and S&P Global have both expanded their methodology for evaluating infrastructure-dependent credit exposure, including attention to whether companies face physical access constraints on executing their capital programs. For companies with significant growth or decarbonization commitments, and the financing structures tied to those commitments, the question of whether execution is feasible on the stated timeline is no longer separate from the credit profile. It's embedded in it. CFOs who have built financial models assuming that energy access is binary, either you have it or you don't, and you plan accordingly, are working with an outdated input. The current reality is that energy access is probabilistic, timeline-dependent, and geographically uneven. A project in one region may energize on schedule. An identical project in a different region may face a multi-year wait. That asymmetry needs to show up in capital planning models. How CFOs should model grid access risk in capital planning frameworks. Finance leaders who are ahead of this problem are doing a few things differently. First, they're including grid access status as a line item in project feasibility assessments, alongside zoning, permitting, and labor. Not as a checkbox, but as a tiered risk factor with probability-weighted timeline scenarios. Second, they're stress testing capital deployment schedules against a range of utility upgrade timelines, including scenarios where energization is delayed 12, 18, or 24 months beyond original assumptions. Third, they're making sure that project financing structures don't include milestone commitments that depend on grid access timing they don't control. None of this requires a new financial system or a dedicated energy team embedded in finance. It requires acknowledging that a variable that was once safely assumed has become a genuine source of financial exposure and treating it accordingly. The competitive advantage of getting grid access right before capital is committed. The companies getting this right aren't just reducing downside risk, they're building a competitive edge. When energy access delays are uneven across geographies, the organizations that have done the diligence on grid availability before committing capital are the ones whose projects close on schedule while competitors' projects sit idle. That's not a marginal advantage. In capital-intensive industries, the difference between a project that energizes on schedule and one that doesn't can represent multiple years of return compression. The balance sheet case for taking grid access seriously isn't complicated. Stranded capital is expensive, delayed revenue is expensive, renegotiated financing is expensive. Preventable exposure is the most expensive of all. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.